Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ross Helia, and this is my final project. I chose to do a PowerPoint over this movie called Memento. It's a Christopher Nolan film. It was made in the year 2000, and I think it's a wonderful film. It's chock full of a lot of the concepts that we talked about in class this semester, and I would love to share them with you. So, in this presentation, you're going to learn a little bit about fixed mindset. You're going to learn a little bit about the noise, what is perceived in presenting self, influences on perception, characteristics of nonverbal communication, and also how to improve listening. Now, this is only a 15-minute presentation, so I just kind of want to preface that there's so much depth and meat to each one of these things, but I'm going to lightly kind of cover them and also apply these concepts to scenes from the film. So the overall setting, it's kind of in the same era or at least the same year as the movie actually came out. So it's kind of in the late 90s, maybe early 2000s. It doesn't really explicitly say, but let's assume that it's in the year 2000 just to give you guys a little context. It takes place in Southern California. This movie is interesting because there's not really a whole lot of places that this movie takes place in. It's kind of centered around a few key areas, and the movie is very repetitive. If you've never seen it, I would highly recommend watching this movie because it is kind of a complex film. It's very interesting. But overall, we have places like the Discount Inn. This is where our main protagonist stays. His name is Lenny, which we'll find out here in a second. We also have Ferdy's Bar. This is a local bar where Natalie, another main character, works. We have Emma's Tattoos. This is a place where our main protagonist gets a lot of his tattoos that he actually covers his body in. And then we also have like an industrial area, kind of where like some murders and like different things happen. So our main protagonist, his name is Lenny, and he's in search of his wife's killer. So the interesting thing about that, though, is ever since his wife had actually died, Lenny has no ability to form new memories. So to combat this, he actually tattoos key information about his wife's murderer on his body, so that way whenever he forgets, he has like all these tattoos that he can like refer to. He has like he takes like Polaroid pictures and like writes on them, and it's really interesting how you have this person who's kind of like disabled in that way, who's really hurt and who's like really like searching for his wife. Great movie, honestly. So our main characters, starting in the bottom left-hand side, this is Lenny. He's played by Guy Pearce. Honestly, he did a great job acting. I really enjoyed this movie. I love his work. I also love the movie Time Machine, if anyone has ever seen that as well. He's a great actor in that movie as well. But Lenny's essentially our protagonist. His wife was murdered, as I mentioned, and he has no ability to form new memories. He still has a self-concept, he knows his identity and things like that, but sometimes he'll just get in the middle of things and then just completely forget what's going on. He also was an insurance adjuster or insurance investigator, and he would investigate claims of fraud, making sure people weren't trying to get insurance money that they couldn't or weren't obligated to receive. And that kind of leads me to my next person, which is going to be the top left. His name is Sammy, and Sammy is an old client of Lenny's, and he's kind of a minor character, but he's still a main character in this movie because Sammy has also lost his memory in the past, and it's just interesting how similar Lenny and Sammy's lives are. They're kind of intertwined. Like I said, highly recommend watching the movie if I'm giving you information and you're interested. Top right, it's going to be Teddy. So Teddy is kind of Lenny's only friend. He feels really slimy, and he feels like he just gives you the heebie-jeebies and the bad vibes. He wants to help, but he kind of has a funny way of showing it, sort of thing. And he claims that he's a cop and like different things like that. And the movie kind of leads you on and obviously leads you into twists and turns, but again, highly recommend watching the movie. That's Teddy. And then Natalie is here in the bottom right. She's a local bartender, kind of a love interest for Lenny. And the two, they stay at each other's houses and different things like that and kind of get involved with each other. So those are kind of the main characters for the film, just to familiarize yourself. And that brings me to my first concept, which is the fixed mindset. So the fixed mindset is essentially a way in which we think about ourselves, others. It's kind of a black and white thinking. It's, you're born a winner, you're born a loser, what have you. There's kind of no getting out of it. Talent is king. You either got it or you don't, kind of a thing. And this first scene, I would argue that Lenny is definitely in that fixed mindset because Lenny reads a picture or one of his notes, and he essentially is so fixated on what that note says that he goes after Teddy and holds a gun to him and tries to kill him. And that's kind of sometimes how the fixed mindset is. We're dead set, laser focused, we're so sure of ourselves, but really we need to pull back and, kind of have a growth mindset, but that's a whole nother concept. But the fixed mindset is kind of like black and white thinking, essentially. Concept number 2 is about noise. So this movie is so interesting because we have so many different things influencing the communication process. And one of those things is Lenny, whenever he talks to people, he has to be looking at them in the eye. He doesn't really talk to people on the phone. He doesn't do anything like that. And in this diner scene with Natalie, whenever he's talking with her, he asks her to take off her sunglasses because he cannot effectively communicate while he can't see her eyes. So essentially, in this scenario, the noise in this situation would be Natalie's sunglasses. Now, that may sound funny because usually whenever we think about noise, we think about environmental noise, which that can be noise as well. But in this case, noise is anything that interferes with our ability to communicate, which in this case would be Natalie's sunglasses. Concept 3, perceived and presenting self. So the perceived self is kind of like the self you know. The presenting self is kind of like the self you show. So this movie is interesting in the fact that every day Lenny wakes up, or even sometimes just at random times, Lenny will kind of totally forget his whole identity. And the reason why Lenny tattoos himself with all that key information is so he can kind of remember his mission and kind of his life purpose, which kind of plays into his perceived self. So something that's interesting is the fact that Lenny has to kind of use his presenting self, the self that he shows others, to come to know his perceived self because of his memory loss issue. So that's kind of something that's interesting throughout the movie, and that's kind of that's a concept that gets played with constantly, especially since memory is such a key thing in this movie. Concept number 4, influences on perception. So this is kind of a somber scene. It's where Lenny's kind of reflecting on his wife's death and his whole memory issues and different things like that. And there's a lot of things that can influence our perception. Sometimes it's cultural things. Sometimes, it's how much money you have or the friends you had or what have you. And sometimes it's even psychological influences. And in this case, with Lenny, since he has a memory issue, he kind of has to digest the fact that he can't really perceive time in the way that he should, or the way that time really flows. So he kind of really can't ever get over his wife's death because he doesn't really know how long it's been and what have you. And that's just kind of such an interesting thing. And whether it's someone that deals with anxiety or someone that deals with depression or, like I said, any of those cultural or societal issues that's going on, those all come into play whenever we're trying to perceive reality. And that's something that this movie plays a lot with. So, concept number 5, characteristics of nonverbal communication. I picked this scene at Natalie's house where Lenny and Natalie are getting into a big argument. It's really heated. Usually, big arguments like that are chock full of wonderful, colorful, nonverbal communication. So essentially, nonverbal communication is a way we say things, or it's the ways we say things without saying things. I actually read a wonderful book on nonverbal communication. I won't get into that here, but they talk about like coddling methods, about like touching your neck, and just kind of like your stance, your tone of voice. All those things would be considered your nonverbal communication. And like I said, the scene is wonderful because it's chock full of nonverbal communication. Natalie's kind of getting up in Lenny's face and she's like pointing at him, like right in his face. And there's a point in the scene where Lenny kind of pulls away and kind of like turns his back to her, kind of like fight or flight method. And Natalie actually starts walking around him, kind of like a hawk would like circle its prey. And that's kind of like the scenario of how nonverbal communication like plays out. And most of these processes, I mean, they're controlled by our limbic system, so that's a very old area of the brain. It's very ancient and sort of unconscious. You can control your nonverbal body language consciously, but more often than not, it's kind of going to happen subconsciously. So we have concept number 6. So, how to improve listening. So, in the final scene, Teddy goes ahead and he spills the beans. Like I said earlier, I don't want to ruin the film for anyone who hasn't seen it because it's a great movie. Like I said, highly recommend watching it. And I tried including as much information as I could without spoiling anything. And in this scene, Teddy and Lenny are kind of like having a heart to heart, and Teddy just goes ahead and he spills the beans. All knowledge is kind of revealed. All the puzzle pieces are tossed on the table, if you will. And whenever Lenny is listening to Teddy, he's got really good eye contact. He's also kind of asking open-ended questions, and those are all key things in how we can improve our listening. That's how we can kind of listen better, to people. It's all about kind of rephrasing and paraphrasing and letting people know that they were heard and kind of like rattling back what was said. That way you can kind of clarify anything and there's less misunderstanding. That's what effective communication is really all about. And like I said, one of the key ways to improve listening is about critically thinking about what's been said and paraphrasing and responding in the right ways. And whenever we do that, we listen more effectively, we understand more effectively, and people just feel heard. And that's a very important part of life. So overall, kind of to tie this all together, we have the fixed mindset, which that was the first concept I talked about. That was like the black and white thinking, kind of like all or nothing. We're either born winners or we're born losers, kind of like strict, cut and dry thinking. And that kind of concept plays into this movie just because, with Lenny, he was kind of really dead set on his ideas and he was very fixated and was not willing to kind of see past or see that maybe there's a possibility that maybe there's another answer. And whenever we, put ourselves in a box like that, we're kind of falling into the fixed mindset. We have noise, which is any phenomenon that interferes with communication. In this case, remember I talked about Natalie's sunglasses and how those were kind of noise to Lenny. Perceived and presenting self. So this is the self. Perceived self is the self we know, and then the presenting self is the self we show. So the self we know is like our personal self-concept. The presenting self is what people come to know as us. Influences on perception. There's many things that shape our views. This could be society. This could be the money we have, yada, yada. With characteristics of nonverbal communication, the things we say without speaking, so it's essentially our body language, how we move, how to improve listening, eye contact, responding with open-ended questions, and critically listening. And thank you so much.